Hello, fellow aspirants. This is me, Dr. Jagdish Jagtap, and today's podcast will be discussing disaster management in extreme detail. Let's get cracking. This is some information about me. Now, what would you call a disaster? Now, suppose if you happen to go to an exam which has 20 questions and you do not know one question out of them, will you call that as a disaster? Certainly not, because you can cope up with it. But suppose you do not know 20 out of 20 questions, then is that a disaster? Definitely it is. So let us learn the UN definition of disaster. A disaster is a serious disruption in the functioning of a community or a society involving large-scale human, material, economical and environmental losses and impacts which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using their own resources. Now these are the very important keywords. I would like you to all to just pause the video and mug up this definition. Now once we understand what a disaster is, we have to manage the disaster. Now you cannot eliminate disasters. Disasters will always happen. So you have to manage them best. So disaster management is the organization, planning and application of measures preparing for, responding to and initial recovery after a disaster. Even this definition should be mugged up. This is the last definition that we have to mug up, that is of an hazard. So hazard is a dangerous phenomena, substance, human activity or condition that may cause loss of life, injury or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihoods and services, social and economic disruption or environmental damage. It's a very tedious definition, but it is a comprehensive definition. It covers every aspect of a hazard. So please mug this up too. Now, if we look at the institutional framework that India has prepared for managing disasters, the first and foremost thing is the Disaster Management Act of 2005. Then we had a disaster management policy in 2009, and at present we have a disaster management plan in 2016. Now all these three things overlap with each other. There is a considerable overlap, but since this is the latest part, let us study this because it will encompass all the other things in it. Now let us understand this basic disaster management cycle. So it has two distinct parts. First is the pre-disaster, second is the post-disaster. Now if this is the point where disaster happens, so after that we have the first thing, that is the response. Now let us take for an example an earthquake. So once the disaster happens, there should be immediate response, that is rescuing the people who are caught underneath. So that would be the first response. Then we have something called as recovery. So those people who are affected, they should be given houses and there should be some kind of recovery. So this is the post-disaster part. But after this, we have to undertake activities in mitigation, that is prevention and risk reduction. So that implementing a proper building code, having safe houses, that comes under this. And then we have preparedness, that even if a disaster happens, we should be well prepared to handle that. So this entire thing is called as the disaster management cycle. Now let us look at the international framework for disaster management. In 2015, this Sendai framework was given in Japan, and it is valid from 2015 to 2030. And the measures are voluntary and non-binding. India is party to this, and India is one of the first countries in the world to incorporate this Sendai framework into our own disaster management plan. So let us look at this Sendai framework. It has 4 priority areas. First is understanding the disaster risk. Second is strengthening the disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Just remember the keywords. First understand the risk, then strengthen the governance. Thirdly, invest in the disaster risk reduction. And finally, enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better. This is important. So if you understand the disaster management cycle, then this is easy to remember. Because first you have to understand the risk, then strengthen disaster risk governance, then move on to invest it, because if you don't invest money into that, then the effort is not going to amount to much, right? And then finally, if disaster does happen, then you have to build it. So build back the infrastructure. So these are the 4 priority areas. Now if you look at the targets, there are 7 global targets, of which we have to reduce a few things, we have to increase a few things. The first thing which you have to reduce is mortality due to disasters. Second thing is affected people of the global population due to disasters. Third is the economic loss. And fourth is the damage to critical infrastructure which is caused by disasters. These 4 things should be reduced as compared to 2015 standards. Then which are the things we should increase? First is the countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategies. Their number should be increased. Secondly, we have to increase international cooperation. And thirdly, we should increase availability and access to multi-hazard early warning systems. Just remember early warning systems. So we have 7 targets here. We have to reduce 4 things, we have to increase 3 things. Now this is the national institutional framework. You don't have to remember everything, just remember key points. Like the key body here is the Cabinet Committee on Security. Then we have the National Crisis Management Committee. We have a National Institute of Disaster Management, National Disaster Response Force, a National Disaster Management Authority, and a similar structure is present at the state level also. That will be headed by the Chief Minister, and this is headed by the Prime Minister. One interesting thing that the National Disaster Management Plan put forth is this levels of disaster. This has been put for the first time. It divides disaster into these levels: level 1, L1, L2, L3. L1 is at the district level. If the disaster can be managed within the district level, it's L1. If it can be managed at the state level, then it's L2. If it cannot be managed at these 2 levels and it becomes a national catastrophe, then it's the L3. And for the first time, there is a scope for notifying a disaster as a national calamity or a national disaster. Suppose a nuclear attack should happen on India, then that could be a national calamity or a national disaster. This is important for the prelims. Like every disaster has a nodal ministry which is in charge of managing the disaster. So these are 15 type of disasters and we have corresponding nodal ministries. Please pause the video and mug it up. You can also remember it by using a few tricks, like biological, it's easy to understand that the health ministry would be involved. Chemical and industrial, the environment ministry is involved. Civil aviation, Ministry of Civil Aviation. Cyclone or tornado, Ministry of Earth Sciences. Tsunami, Earth Sciences Ministry. Drought, hailstorm, all of them affect agriculture, so Ministry of Agriculture will be involved. Earthquake, again Ministry of Earth Sciences. Flood, Ministry of Water Resources. Forest fire, Environment Ministry. Landslides, Ministry of Mines, because mostly mines are more susceptible to landslides. Avalanches, these happen in the higher Himalayas where soldiers are positioned, so the Ministry of Defense is in charge of avalanches. Nuclear and radiological emergencies, obviously in the Department of Atomic Energy. Rail accidents, Ministry of Railways. Road accidents, Ministry of Road Transport. And urban floods, Ministry of Urban Development. So just mug up all of them. It might be asked as the following question. So this is the last bit of data that we all should be mugging up by heart, because you can use this data in essays and you can begin almost any disaster management related answer with this data. First and foremost, 68% of India is vulnerable to drought, 58% to earthquakes, 12% to floods, and out of a coastline of 7,500 kilometers, around 5,700 kilometers is prone to cyclones and tsunamis. You just have to reverse this. 5 you put it here, 7 you put it here, and that's this figure. And cumulatively, government spends 12% resources revenue on disaster management, and it amounts to 2% GDP loss. So these are huge numbers. So this gives us a grasp of the scale that we are dealing with. And since India is vulnerable on so many fronts, that is why disaster management is a very critical part of our development agenda. It has to be incorporated into our development processes so that whatever we do is more sustainable and more disaster resistant. Thanks a lot. If you want, I'll do a second podcast of why live, and I'll deal with each and every disaster in detail, like urban floods, tsunamis, cyclones, and the exact procedures for managing those disasters. So please comment, and if you have any queries, I'll answer them as soon as possible. Thanks a lot. Have an awesome day.